What if everything you remember about Interstellar is just the surface, and the real story is something much quieter, something almost hidden beneath the surface? Because honestly, the first time you watch it, your brain is trying to keep up with everything at once. Wormholes, time dilation, black holes, it feels massive, overwhelming, almost too big to fully process. But if you slow down, if you sit with it just a little longer, you start to notice something different. This isn't really a story about space. It's about a man who makes a decision he can't undo and a daughter who refuses to accept it. And in this breakdown, we're not just going through the story. We're stepping inside Cooper's perspective, understanding what drives him, what fractures him, and why every moment in this film quietly revolves around one emotional center: Murph. The film opens in a way that almost feels deceptive. There's no explosion, no dramatic introduction, no sense of urgency. Just silence. Dust drifting slowly through the air, settling on forgotten surfaces like time itself has started to decay. The world doesn't feel like it's ending. It feels like it already has. And if you notice carefully, the cinematography leans into that feeling immediately. The frames are wide, but not freeing. They are empty. Colors feel drained, almost suffocated, like the planet is slowly losing the will to sustain life. This isn't a sudden apocalypse. It's erosion, a quiet, relentless fading. And right in the middle of that, there's Cooper. He isn't introduced as a hero. There's no grand entrance, no defining moment that establishes him as extraordinary. Instead, he's just there, driving through fields, managing crops, fixing machines. But there's something in the way he carries himself that doesn't quite fit this world, a kind of restlessness, like he's been forced into a life that doesn't belong to him. And what makes this so effective is how subtle it is. There's no speech where he explains his past. You feel it through behavior. The way he looks at the sky for a second longer than anyone else. The way frustration leaks into small conversations. It's controlled, but it's there. What makes this even more interesting is the world around him. Humanity hasn't just lost resources, it's lost ambition. When Cooper visits the school and hears teachers explain that the moon landing was faked to bankrupt the Soviet Union, it's not played as shocking in the moment. It's casual, almost normal. But that's what makes it disturbing. Exploration has been rewritten as a mistake. Progress is seen as unnecessary. And in that single scene, the film quietly tells you everything you need to know about why Cooper feels out of place. He doesn't belong in a world that stopped looking up. And then there's Murph. Their relationship doesn't feel polished or overly sentimental. It feels real, slightly messy, filled with small tensions and deep affection at the same time. She's curious, stubborn, and intensely connected to him. But more than that, she depends on him in a way that goes beyond normal father-daughter dynamics. And if you pay attention, the film treats her differently. The camera lingers. Moments around her feel heavier, like the story itself is leaning toward her without fully explaining why. There's a quiet importance placed on her from the very beginning. Then the ghost enters the story. At first, it feels almost familiar. Books falling from shelves. Dust forming strange patterns. Something unseen trying to communicate. But the way these moments are presented changes everything. There's no dramatic music telling you how to feel. No exaggerated reactions. It's calm, almost observational. The camera watches instead of reacts. And that creates a different kind of tension. Not fear, but curiosity. Because nothing here feels random. It feels intentional, but unexplained. Murph believes it's a ghost. Cooper doesn't. He looks for patterns, logic, something measurable. And when the dust forms coordinates, the film quietly shifts from mystery into direction. But even here, it doesn't rush. The journey to those coordinates feels grounded, almost documentary-like. Natural lighting, steady pacing, minimal score. It feels real, and that realism becomes important because what they are about to find could easily feel unbelievable. A hidden NASA facility. The reveal isn't loud or dramatic. It's controlled, understated, and that choice makes it feel more authentic. When Cooper meets Professor Brand, the tone of the film subtly changes again. For the first time, there's something resembling hope. But it's not comforting. It's heavy, because the solution they present isn't about saving Earth. It's about leaving it behind. And this is where the real conflict begins. Cooper is given a choice that doesn't feel like a choice at all. Stay and watch the world slowly collapse around his children, or leave, knowing he might never see them again. And what makes this moment so powerful is how personal it is. The film doesn't frame it as a heroic sacrifice. It frames it through Murph, through her eyes. It feels like abandonment, like his choosing something else over her. The goodbye scene is one of the most emotionally controlled moments in the entire film. It doesn't rely on loud music or dramatic dialogue. Instead, it holds back. The camera stays close, almost uncomfortably so. Murph refuses to say goodbye. She believes the ghost told her he shouldn't go, and in her mind, that makes his decision even more painful. What's happening here isn't just separation. It's a fracture. And Cooper leaves anyway. Honestly, this is the moment everything changes. Because from here on, every second he experiences in space is tied to that decision. Every year that passes on Earth becomes a consequence of it. And the film never lets you forget that. The launch sequence opens the film visually in a way we haven't seen yet. The frames expand. The colors become richer. There's a sense of movement and scale that contrasts sharply with the suffocating stillness of Earth. But even in that beauty, there's isolation. Space doesn't feel welcoming. It feels indifferent, vast, silent, and completely unconcerned with human survival. Then comes the wormhole. Positioned near Saturn, perfectly spherical, almost unnaturally smooth. It doesn't look like science fiction. It looks real, like something that could exist just beyond our understanding. And that realism is what makes it so compelling. The film doesn't treat it like magic. It treats it like discovery. As they approach it, the music begins to rise. Not in a traditional cinematic way, but through an organ score that feels almost spiritual. It doesn't just accompany the scene, it fills it, builds pressure, creates a sense that something significant is about to happen. Inside the wormhole, reality bends. Light stretches. Space feels unstable. But what stands out isn't just the visuals, it's the reaction. There's fear, yes, but also awe, especially when Amelia reaches out and feels something. A presence. A connection that shouldn't be possible. And the film doesn't explain it. It just lets it sit there. Because at this point, something subtle starts to form in the background. A question that isn't fully clear yet, but impossible to ignore. What if they are not alone in this journey? And more importantly, what if everything happening has already happened? The moment they come out on the other side of the wormhole, something feels off. Not in an obvious way, not like a sudden threat or immediate danger, but in the kind of silence that lingers just a little too long. Space looks different, hey. It's still vast, still endless, but there's a density to it. Like every star, every shadow carries weight. And if you notice carefully, the pacing slows down again. The film doesn't rush into action. It lets you absorb this new reality, because crossing the wormhole wasn't just a physical transition, it was a narrative one. From this point forward, everything becomes more uncertain. They are now in a different galaxy, completely cut off from Earth except for the fragile connection of time-stretched communication. And that idea alone quietly raises the stakes. Because distance here isn't just measured in space, it's measured in years, in missed moments, in everything Cooper is already starting to lose without fully realizing it. Professor Brand had already explained the mission before they left. Multiple planets, each a possible new home for humanity, each explored by astronauts who went before them. But now, standing on the edge of that unknown, the mission stops feeling theoretical. It becomes immediate, urgent, real. And the first destination is Miller's planet. What makes this choice interesting is how it's presented. It seems like the obvious option. The closest planet to the wormhole, the one sending the strongest signal. Logical, efficient. But the film quietly plants doubt. The planet orbits dangerously close to a massive black hole, Gargantua. And that proximity isn't just a visual detail. It's a threat that hasn't fully revealed itself yet. The approach to the planet is deceptively calm. From orbit, it looks almost peaceful. Endless water stretching across the surface, reflecting light in a way that feels strangely serene. But there's something unsettling about it too. There's no land, no variation, just water. And that uniformity creates tension, because it feels unnatural, like something is being hidden beneath that simplicity. As they descend, The sound design becomes more pronounced. The low hum of the ship, the subtle creaks, the distant echo of something you can't quite identify. It builds discomfort without ever announcing it. And when they finally land, the scale of the planet becomes clearer. The water isn't deep, it's shallow, stretching endlessly in every direction, like a thin layer covering something much larger. And then the realization hits. Time moves differently, hey. What makes this concept so powerful isn't just the science behind it, it's how the film translates it emotionally. 1 hour on this planet equals 7 years on Earth. And suddenly, every second becomes heavy. Every decision carries consequences that extend far beyond the moment. This isn't just exploration anymore. It's sacrifice measured in time. Cooper hesitates, even if just for a second. And that hesitation matters. Because for the first time since leaving Earth, the mission directly collides with his role as a father. Every minute he spends here is time he's losing with his children. Years of their lives. Gone. Without him. But they proceed anyway. Because the signal is strong. Because it's their best chance. Because turning back would mean accepting failure before they've even begun. Rumley stays behind on the Endurance, orbiting safely above, while Cooper, Brand, and Doyle descend to investigate. And what's interesting here is how the film splits perspective. Up above, time moves normally. Down here, it distorts. That separation creates tension before anything even goes wrong. At first, everything seems manageable. They locate the beacon, confirm that this is indeed Miller's location. But something doesn't add up. There's no sign of her, no equipment, no trace of activity beyond the signal itself. And that absence becomes louder the longer they stand there. Then Brand notices it. Mountains. But they are not mountains. They are waves. Massive, towering walls of water, moving slowly at first, almost deceptively so. And the way the film reveals this is brilliant. It doesn't cut to a dramatic wide shot immediately. It lets the characters realize it first. Confusion turning into recognition. Recognition turning into fear. Because those waves aren't just large, they are catastrophic. And suddenly, everything accelerates. The calm pacing shatters. The sound intensifies. The ticking, subtle at first, starts to emerge, almost like a reminder that time here is slipping away faster than they can comprehend. And what makes this sequence so effective isn't just the danger, it's the pressure of time layered on top of it. They rush back to the ship, but the environment itself is working against them. The water drags, slows, resists. Every movement feels heavier, like the planet doesn't want them to leave. And when the wave finally crashes, it's overwhelming. Not just visually, but emotionally. Because in that moment, it becomes clear that this planet was never a real option. It was a trap. Doyle doesn't make it, and his death isn't drawn out or dramatized. It's sudden, almost abrupt, and that's what makes it hit harder. There's no time to process it, no space to grieve, because survival takes priority. Escape becomes the only focus. When they finally break free and ascend back to the Endurance, there's a sense of relief, but it's incomplete. Because something else is waiting for them. Time. Rumley has aged. What felt like a few hours for Cooper and Brand has been over 20 years for him. And that moment, seeing him, hearing his voice, realizing the gap, is one of the most quietly devastating reveals in the film. Because this is the first time the cost of the mission becomes visible in a human way. 23 years. Gone. And then come the messages. Cooper sits down, expecting updates, maybe a few years of missed moments. But what he gets is something else entirely. A lifetime compressed into recordings. His son growing up, changing, struggling, becoming someone Cooper doesn't even recognize anymore. Milestones he wasn't there for. Pain he couldn't help with. A life that moved forward without him. And the way this scene is shot, it doesn't cut away. It stays with him, forces you to sit in it, to feel the weight of every missed second. But then Murph appears. Older now, hardened, and her message isn't warm. It isn't hopeful. It's angry. She tells him the truth he's been avoiding. That he left. That he chose this. And that promise he made, to come back, it feels broken. And for the first time, Cooper breaks. Not loudly, not dramatically, but internally. You can see it in his expression, in the way he struggles to hold himself together. Because everything he justified, everything he believed he was doing for the right reasons, suddenly feels fragile. And this is where the film shifts again. Because now the question isn't just about survival. It's about whether the cost was ever worth it. That moment with the messages doesn't just hurt. It changes something inside Cooper permanently. Up until now, he's been holding on to a kind of internal justification. This belief that everything he's sacrificing will eventually make sense, that one day his children will understand why he left. But watching those years unfold without him, seeing his son grow distant and his daughter grow cold, it cracks that belief in a way that's impossible to ignore. And what makes this even more powerful is how restrained the film remains. There's no dramatic breakdown filled with loud music or exaggerated emotion. It's quiet, almost suffocatingly quiet. The camera stays close to his face, forcing you to sit in every second of realization as it hits him that time didn't wait. It moved on, with or without him. And then Murph's message lingers. Not just the words, but the tone. There's a finality to it. She isn't waiting anymore. She isn't hoping anymore. She's accepted something that Cooper hasn't fully processed yet, that he may never come back. And that idea hangs over everything that follows. Because from this point on, every decision Cooper makes carries not just the weight of the mission, but the growing awareness that he's already lost something he can't recover. But the mission doesn't stop. If anything, it becomes more urgent. They've lost decades. Miller's planet was a failure. And now they are left with fewer options, less time, and more pressure than ever before. The next choice is between two remaining planets, one explored by Dr. Mann, the other by Dr. Edmonds. And this is where the film introduces something subtle but incredibly important. The data they are relying on isn't just scientific, it's human. It comes from people who made choices under extreme conditions. People who might have been afraid, desperate, alone. And that introduces doubt. Amelia leans toward Edmonds. Not purely because of logic, but because of something she struggles to fully explain. A feeling, a connection. And what makes this moment so interesting is how the film treats it. It doesn't dismiss her reasoning, but it doesn't fully validate it either. It sits in that uncomfortable space between science and emotion. And if you notice carefully, this is where the film begins to question its own rules. Can love be something more than just a human reaction? Can it act as a kind of guidance, something that transcends distance and time? Cooper doesn't buy it. To him, the mission has to remain grounded in logic. They've already lost too much to risk another mistake. And Dr. Mann's planet offers stronger data, clearer signals. It feels like the safer choice. And that word, safe, becomes dangerously misleading. They choose Mann. And even before they arrive, there's a shift in tone. The visuals change. The light becomes harsher, colder. Space feels less like wonder and more like isolation. And when they finally land on the planet, that feeling intensifies. It's not water this time. It's ice. Endless, jagged, unforgiving ice stretching across the landscape. There's no sense of life here. No movement. Just stillness. But there's a signal. Dr. Mann is alive. And when they find him, frozen in cryo-sleep, there's a sense of relief that almost feels out of place. After everything they've been through, finally finding a survivor, it feels like a win. Like maybe, just maybe, this mission is back on track. When Mann wakes up, his reaction feels genuine, emotional. He embraces them, thanks them, expresses what sounds like real gratitude. And what makes this moment so effective is how human it feels. After so much isolation, after years alone, his relief doesn't seem suspicious. It feels earned. But something isn't right. And the film doesn't reveal it immediately. It lets it simmer beneath the surface. Small details. Slight inconsistencies. The way Mann talks about the planet, it's hopeful, but not entirely convincing. There's a subtle hesitation, a lack of concrete proof behind his optimism. And if you're paying attention, you start to feel it. That quiet sense that something is being held back. Meanwhile, Cooper is still carrying the weight of those messages. You can see it in how he interacts, how he listens, how he reacts to information. He's no longer just a pilot on a mission. He's a father running out of time in a way that no one else fully understands. Every decision now feels more personal, more urgent. Amelia, on the other hand, continues to push for Edmonds. And this creates tension between them that isn't loud or confrontational, but deeply rooted. Because at its core, this isn't just a disagreement about data. It's a clash between two ways of understanding the world. Logic versus something less measurable, something more human. And this is where the film becomes even more layered. Because while the characters debate which path to take, the audience is left questioning something bigger. Can you trust data collected by someone who was completely alone? What happens to objectivity when survival is at stake? And more importantly, what would you do in that situation? Man begins to guide them across the planet, explaining the conditions, the structure of the ice, the potential for a habitable base. But as they move further, the environment itself starts to feel unstable. The ground shifts. The ice cracks in subtle ways. It doesn't feel solid. It feels temporary. Like everything here is on the verge of collapse. And then the truth starts to surface. Not all at once. Not in a dramatic reveal, but piece by piece. The data man sent, it wasn't entirely real. The planet isn't stable. It isn't viable. And that hope he presented, it was built on something else entirely. Fear, loneliness, the desperate need to be rescued. When Cooper realizes this, the shift is immediate. Not just in the plot, but in the emotional tone of the film. Because this isn't just a failed mission. It's a betrayal. And not a malicious one at first glance, but something more complicated. Something that forces you to confront an uncomfortable idea. Even the best of us can break. And Dr. Mann is about to show exactly how far that breaking point can go. The moment the truth about Dr. Mann begins to unravel, the entire tone of the film shifts into something colder, sharper, almost suffocating in a different way than before. Up until now, the dangers they've faced have come from nature, from physics, from forces that are indifferent but predictable. But this is human. And that makes it far more unsettling. Because you can prepare for a wave. You can calculate gravity. But you can't always anticipate what someone will do when they've been completely alone, when survival becomes the only thing that matters. Man doesn't confess immediately. He deflects. He rationalizes. He tries to maintain control of the narrative. And what makes this so compelling is how calm he remains at first. There's no sudden villain reveal, no exaggerated shift in behavior. Instead, he explains his actions in a way that almost makes sense, at least on the surface. He talks about the mission, about the importance of continuing, about how humanity depends on success. But underneath that, there's something else building. Something fragile. Cooper presses him. And that's when the mask starts to crack. Man admits the data was falsified. The planet was never viable. He knew it. He always knew it. And yet, he sent the signal anyway. Because he needed to be found. Needed someone to come. And in that moment, the film does something incredibly important. It doesn't frame him as purely evil. It frames him as human in the worst possible way. Because his actions aren't driven by malice. They are driven by fear, by isolation, by the overwhelming instinct to survive, even at the cost of others. What makes this even more disturbing is how quietly it escalates. There's no dramatic music swell when man turns against Cooper. No cinematic cue preparing you for what's about to happen. It just happens. One moment they are talking, the next, man attacks. And the suddenness of it is shocking, raw. It feels real in a way that staged conflict often doesn't. They struggle on the icy surface, the environment itself adding to the chaos. The ground shifts beneath them, cracks forming, threatening to give way at any moment. And the sound design here is incredibly precise. Breathing becomes louder. Movements feel heavier. Every impact echoes in the thin atmosphere. It's not just a fight. It's a desperate, clumsy attempt to survive. Man overpowers Cooper. And then he leaves him. What makes this moment hit so hard isn't just the betrayal. It's the justification man gives as he walks away. He talks about how people aren't meant to face death alone. How, in those final moments, all the grand ideas, all the noble intentions fade away, and what's left is fear. Pure, undeniable fear. And in his mind, everything he's done is a response to that fear. Not a choice, but an inevitability. Cooper is left behind, his oxygen depleting, his body struggling against the environment. And the film doesn't rush this either. It lingers just long enough for you to feel the panic creeping in. The isolation. The realization that this might be how it ends for him, not in some heroic sacrifice, but alone, abandoned on a frozen world. But Amelia reaches him, and that rescue, while urgent, doesn't feel triumphant. It feels necessary. Survival, not victory. Because even as they escape, the damage has already been done. Man has taken one of their ships and is heading back to the Endurance. And that creates a new kind of tension, one that builds quietly but relentlessly. Back on the Endurance, things are still. Almost too still. Rummelly, who stayed behind again, is working, waiting, unaware of what's about to happen. And the film gives you just enough time to settle into that calm before it breaks. Because when man returns, he doesn't hesitate anymore. The rationalizations are gone. The fear has taken full control. The explosion is sudden, violent, and devastating. Rummelly doesn't survive. And just like Doyle before him, his death isn't stretched out or dramatized. It's abrupt, almost unfair in how quickly it happens. But that's the point. The film isn't interested in giving these moments cinematic closure. It presents them as consequences. Immediate and irreversible. Now man is alone again, but this time, he has control of the Endurance. And what makes this situation even more intense is how fragile everything is. The Endurance isn't just a ship. It's their lifeline, their only connection to the mission, to survival, to any possibility of success. And now it's in the hands of someone who has already proven he'll do whatever it takes to stay alive. Cooper and Amelia race back, knowing they are running out of time. And this is where the pacing accelerates again. The film moves faster, but it doesn't lose clarity. Every action feels deliberate, every second meant, because the stakes are no longer abstract. They are immediate. If man succeeds, everything is lost. When he attempts to dock with the Endurance, the tension peaks. Because he isn't trained for it. He doesn't fully understand the mechanics, the precision required. But he tries anyway, because in his mind, there's no other option. And that desperation becomes catastrophic. The docking fails. The alignment is off. And in an instant, everything collapses. The explosion tears through the Endurance. And suddenly, the ship is spinning. Out of control. What follows is one of the most intense sequences in the entire film, not because of loud chaos, but because of controlled chaos. The camera tracks the rotation, the movement disorienting but precise. The sound design shifts again, pulling back in places, emphasizing the vacuum, the isolation of space. And Cooper makes a decision. He's going to match the spin. What makes this moment so powerful isn't just the action, it's the calculation behind it. The understanding of physics, the willingness to risk everything on timing, precision, and instinct. And the film lets you feel every second of the build-up, the alignment, the margin for error shrinking with each rotation. And when he finally docks, it's not clean. It's violent, but it works. For a brief moment, there's stability again. Control. Survival. But even then, the film doesn't let you settle. Because the damage to the Endurance is severe. Resources are limited. Time is still slipping away. And now, the mission stands at its most fragile point. Because they've lost crew. They've lost trust. And more importantly, they've lost certainty. All that's left is a choice. And whatever they choose next, there's no turning back. After the chaos settles, there's this brief moment where everything feels strangely quiet again, but it's not the same kind of silence from before. This one feels heavier, like the aftermath of something that shouldn't have happened but did anyway. The Endurance is damaged, barely holding together. And for the first time, the mission doesn't just feel difficult, it feels like it's slipping out of their control entirely. And if you notice carefully, the film slows down here on purpose. Not to give relief, but to let the weight of everything sink in. Because they didn't just lose time or resources, they lost people. And more importantly, they lost trust. Cooper regains control of the ship, but even that victory feels temporary. There's no celebration, no sense of triumph, just urgency. Systems are failing, oxygen is limited, and every calculation now carries more risk than before. And this is where the story becomes less about exploration and more about survival under pressure. The margin for error is gone. Amelia is the first to say it clearly. They have to make a final decision. No more second chances. No more alternate paths. It comes down to two options: return toward Earth and abandon the mission, or continue forward and commit fully to finding a new home for humanity. And what makes this moment so powerful is how personal it becomes again. Because this isn't just a strategic choice, it's an emotional one. Cooper wants to go back. Not loudly, not dramatically, but you can feel it. After everything he's seen, after watching decades of his children's lives disappear in minutes, the idea of continuing forward starts to feel unbearable. He's already lost too much. And deep down, there's this growing realization that even if he completes the mission, it might not matter to the people he left behind. But Amelia sees it differently. To her, turning back would make everything meaningless. Every sacrifice, every death, every second lost, it would all lead to nothing. And she holds on to something Cooper is struggling to accept now: belief. Not just in the mission, but in something less tangible. The idea that love, connection, instinct, they might actually guide them where logic alone can't. And this is where the film does something really interesting. It doesn't present one of them as right and the other as wrong. Instead, it lets both perspectives exist at the same time. Cooper represents logic shaped by loss. Amelia represents emotion shaped by hope. And neither one is complete on its own. The argument between them isn't explosive, it's quiet, controlled, but deeply intense. Because underneath every word is something unspoken: regret, fear, the weight of everything they've already endured. And when they finally reach a decision, it doesn't feel like a victory. They choose to continue toward Edmund's planet, but they don't have enough fuel. And that's where the plan changes again. If they want to reach Edmund's, they need to use the gravitational pull of Gargantua. A slingshot maneuver that will push them forward, but at a cost. Because getting that close to the black hole means dealing with extreme time dilation again. More time lost. More years slipping away on Earth. And this is where Cooper makes a decision that shifts everything. He decides to sacrifice himself. Not immediately, not in a dramatic declaration, but through calculation. He realizes that if they reduce the ship's mass, they can gain enough speed to reach Edmonds. And the only way to do that is to detach parts of the Endurance, including his own module. At first, it sounds like strategy, but underneath it, it's something else. It's acceptance. And what makes this moment so powerful is how quietly it happens. There's no speech about heroism, no emotional build-up trying to force a reaction. It's almost matter-of-fact. Like Cooper has finally reached a point where he understands that the mission might succeed, but he won't be part of the ending. Amelia doesn't fully process it at first. She focuses on the plan, on the mechanics, on the execution. But there's a moment, just a brief one, where something shifts in her expression. Like she realizes what Cooper is really doing, what he's really choosing. And still, they go through with it. The approach toward Gargantua is unlike anything the film has shown so far. Visually, it's overwhelming. The black hole doesn't feel like an object. It feels like a presence. Massive, distorted, bending light in ways that almost don't look real. And the sound design here becomes something else entirely. The organ score returns, but it's deeper now. Heavier, almost like a warning. Time starts to stretch again. Every second becomes uncertain. And as they prepare for the maneuver, the tension builds in a completely different way than before. It's not about immediate danger. It's about inevitability. About knowing what's coming, but moving forward anyway. When the moment finally arrives, it's fast, precise, unforgiving. The ship detaches. Cooper lets go. And just like that, he's falling. But what makes this moment unforgettable isn't just the action. It's the emotion behind it. Because as he drifts toward the black hole, there's no panic, no desperation, just a quiet understanding that this is the only way. And for the first time in the entire film, Cooper isn't trying to get back. He's letting go. But what he doesn't realize yet is that this isn't the end of his journey. It's the beginning of something far stranger. As Cooper drifts away from the Endurance, something about the moment feels unreal. Not in a loud, dramatic way, but in that quiet, almost suspended sense where time itself seems to hesitate. The ship disappears into the distance, Amelia's voice fading, and for the first time, Cooper is completely alone. No mission, no crew, no control, just the pull of Gargantua, and whatever waits beyond it. And this is where the film takes a turn that most people don't fully process the first time they watch it. Because logically, this should be the end. A human falling into a black hole doesn't survive. There's no version of physics, no realistic outcome where this works. And yet, the film doesn't treat it like death. It treats it like transition. And if you notice carefully, everything about the presentation begins to shift. The visuals soften, the sound changes, and the chaos you would expect is replaced by something almost controlled. Cooper braces for impact, but it never comes. Instead, he passes through, and suddenly, he's somewhere else. At first, it's disorienting. There's no clear sense of direction, no up or down, no familiar structure to hold on to. But then shapes begin to form. Lines, patterns, repeating structures stretching infinitely in every direction. And what makes this so fascinating is how the film visualizes something that technically shouldn't be visible at all. This is the tesseract, a representation of higher dimensional space, built in a way that the human mind can attempt to understand. And instead of presenting it as something abstract or incomprehensible, the film anchors it to something deeply personal. Murph's room, not just once, but infinitely repeated. Every moment of her childhood, every second that Cooper lived through, now existing simultaneously, layered across time like a physical structure he can move. And this is where the emotional core of the film fully reveals itself. Because all of the science, all of the complexity, all of the spectacle, it all leads back to this one place. Her room, her timeline, At first, Cooper doesn't understand it. He moves through the space, reaching out, trying to make sense of what he's seeing. And the way this is shot is incredibly important. The camera follows him closely, but the background feels endless, overwhelming, like his inside something far bigger than he can comprehend, even though it's built from something so familiar. Then he sees it, the moment from before. Murph as a child, sitting in her room, convinced there's a ghost trying to communicate with her. And suddenly, everything connects. What he thought was random, what he tried to explain with logic, it was him. That realization doesn't hit all at once. It builds, slowly, carefully, because the idea itself is overwhelming. He wasn't just part of the story, he was shaping it. Every book that fell, every pattern in the dust, every signal, it all came from this moment. And now, he understands why he's here. Not to escape, not to survive, but to communicate. And this is where the film does something incredibly bold. It takes one of the most complex scientific ideas imaginable and grounds it in something purely emotional. Because Cooper doesn't start thinking like a scientist. He thinks like a father. He tries to reach her. At first, it's clumsy, desperate. He pushes against the boundaries of the tesseract, trying to make an impact, trying to be seen, to be heard. But the structure doesn't respond the way he expects. It resists direct interaction, forcing him to find another way. And that's when he realizes something crucial. He can't speak to her, but he can influence what she sees. The books, the watch, the dust, all of it becomes a form of language. And suddenly, the ghost from the beginning of the film isn't mysterious anymore. It's intentional. It's him, reaching across time, trying to guide events in a way that will lead to this exact moment. But there's a problem. Murph doesn't understand. Not yet. From her perspective, it's still random, still confusing. And this is where the tension builds again, not through danger, but through urgency. Because Cooper realizes he's running out of time in a way that's completely different from before. Not seconds or minutes, but opportunities. Chances to get it right. And then Tars appears. Even here, in this impossible space, Tars is present. Still functioning, still calculating. And what makes this moment so important is how it bridges the gap between emotion and logic. Because while Cooper is driven by feeling, by instinct, Tars brings precision, data, understanding. Together, they figure it out. The quantum data collected inside the black hole, the information humanity needs to solve the gravity equation, it can be transmitted. But only if Cooper finds a way to encode it into something Murph will recognize, something she'll trust. And that's when he looks at the watch. The same watch he left behind. The same watch Murph kept all those years. Time. It becomes the key. Using the second hand, Cooper begins to send the data, not as words, not as signals in space, but as movement. Tiny, precise variations that carry meaning. And what makes this so powerful is how subtle it is. From the outside, it looks like nothing, just a watch ticking. But inside that movement is everything. And Murph finally understands. Back on Earth, now older, now hardened by years of frustration and unanswered questions, she looks at the watch one more time. And something clicks. Not emotionally, intellectually. She sees the pattern, the intention behind it. And in that moment, the connection is complete. Across time, across space, across everything that separated, he kept his promise. Not in the way either of them expected, but in the only way that was ever possible. And as the data is transmitted, as the equation is solved, as humanity finally finds a path forward, the Tesseract begins to collapse. Its purpose fulfilled, its structure fading, and Cooper is pulled away, not falling anymore, but being released. And the question that lingers is no longer about survival. It's about what happens after you've already changed everything. When the Tesseract begins to collapse, it doesn't feel violent or chaotic. It feels deliberate, like something that has completed its purpose and no longer needs to exist. The endless layers of Murph's room begin folding inward, the light dimming slowly, the structure shrinking as if time itself is closing a chapter. And Cooper doesn't panic. He doesn't try to hold on to anything, because in that moment, he finally understands what this place was. Not a prison, not a miracle, a bridge. Something built to connect 2 points that were never supposed to meet, except they did. And then, it's gone. There's no dramatic fall, no sudden impact, just a quiet release into darkness. For a moment, it feels like nothing exists. No sound, no movement, no sense of direction. And then, slowly, light begins to return. Cooper wakes up. At first, it doesn't make sense. The environment is too calm, too clean, too controlled. After everything he's just been through, this kind of stillness feels unnatural. There's no dust in the air, no tension in the atmosphere, no sense of urgency pressing down on him. Just silence. Soft, contained, almost artificial. And that's what makes it unsettling, because it's the complete opposite of the world he left behind. He sits up, trying to understand where he is. A room, a bed, a window, and beyond that window, something impossible. Saturn. He's on a station, orbiting the very place where everything changed. And for a moment, it feels like a dream he hasn't fully woken up from. Because logically, this shouldn't be happening. He fell into a black hole. There's no version of that story where he survives, where he wakes up in a controlled environment like nothing happened. But the film doesn't rush to explain it. It lets you sit in that confusion, because Cooper is feeling it too. Then people enter. Voices, movement, questions. And slowly, the reality starts to form around him. He was found near Saturn, drifting, alive, against every known law of physics, against every expectation. He made it back. But the how isn't what matters here. The film shifts focus to something more important. What happened while he was gone? Because time didn't stop. It never does. Cooper hasn't aged much, not in the way he should have. But everyone else, they have. Years passed. Decades. Entire lifetimes moved forward while he was experiencing something completely different. And that gap creates a quiet kind of distance that's hard to process. Because the world he's in now, it isn't the one he left. He starts to walk through the station, and this is where the film's visual storytelling becomes incredibly subtle but powerful. The design of the station mirrors Earth. Fields, houses, open spaces, everything curved into this massive structure that simulates gravity. It's humanity trying to recreate what it lost, not just physically, but emotionally. A memory of home, rebuilt in space. And then he sees it, a familiar house. His house, reconstructed inside the station like a preserved piece of history. And this moment hits differently than anything else so far. Because it's not just about survival anymore, it's about memory. About what people choose to hold on to, even after everything changes. Then comes the name, Murph. The station is named after her. And suddenly, everything connects again. She didn't just solve the equation. She became the reason humanity made it this far. The symbol of their survival. And for a second, there's a sense of pride that almost surfaces, but it's immediately complicated by something else. Time. Because while she became this figure, this legacy, she lived an entire life without him. And that realization settles in quietly. He asks to see her. And this is where the emotional tension begins to build again, but in a completely different way than before. It's not about separation anymore. It's about change. About facing something you've been holding onto for so long, and realizing it isn't the same. When Cooper enters the room, everything slows down. The sound fades slightly. The movement becomes more deliberate. And there she is. Murph. Older. Fragile. Surrounded by family. For a moment, it's hard to reconcile the image in front of him with the child he remembers. Because in his mind, she's still that little girl in the bedroom, waiting for him to come back. But reality doesn't pause like that. It moves forward, whether you're there or not. And then she looks at him. There's no confusion, no hesitation. She knows. Immediately. Because for her, the idea that he would come back was never a question. It was a belief she held on to, even when everything else told her to let go. And that recognition, it doesn't need words. It just exists between them, filling the space that time created. Their conversation is quiet, but it carries the weight of everything. She tells him he came back, and it's not said with surprise. It's said with certainty, like she always knew this moment would happen, even if she didn't know when or how. And what makes this so powerful is how restrained it is. There's no dramatic reunion, no overwhelming emotion trying to force the moment. It feels real, controlled, complete. But then she says something that shifts everything again. No parent should watch their child die. And in that sentence, there's acceptance. She isn't asking him to stay. She isn't holding on to him anymore. She's letting him go. Because her life, it already happened. She had her journey, her struggles, her victories. And he wasn't there for most of it. Not physically, but in a different way. He was always part of it. The ghost, the message, the watch. All of it connects back to him. And that's enough. For her, it's enough. So she tells him to leave, to find something else, to keep going. And that moment doesn't feel like loss, it feels like closure. Because their story isn't being cut short, it's being completed. And now, Cooper is left standing in a world that no longer needs him in the way it once did. No mission, no urgency, no one waiting, just possibility. And that's something he hasn't felt in a long time. But then, a thought returns. Amelia, still out there, still on Edmund's planet, alone. And suddenly, the direction becomes clear again. But this time, it's different. This isn't about saving humanity. This isn't about sacrifice. This is about choice. For the first time in the entire story, Cooper gets to decide what he wants, not what he has to do. And that shift is subtle, but incredibly important. Because everything up until now has been driven by necessity, by responsibility, by survival. But now, it's personal. He looks out at the station one more time, at the life humanity built from the brink of extinction, at the future that exists because of everything that happened. And there's a quiet understanding in that moment. He did his part. And now, he's free to begin again. Not as a pilot on a mission. Not as a father trying to return. But as someone moving forward, towards something unknown. And maybe, something worth finding. What's interesting is how the film doesn't rush Cooper's decision after that moment with Murph. It lets it sit. It lets the weight of everything finally settle into something quieter, almost peaceful, but not entirely. Because for the first time in the entire story, there's no pressure pushing him forward. No mission countdown. No immediate danger. No life or death calculation forcing his next move. And that absence of urgency feels unfamiliar. Almost uncomfortable. He walks through the station slowly. And if you notice carefully, the pacing here mirrors the very beginning of the film, but with a completely different emotional tone. Back then, the slowness felt suffocating, like the world was closing in on him. Now, it feels open, wide, but also uncertain. Because freedom, in this context, comes with a question he hasn't had to face in a long time. What do you do when you're no longer needed? The station itself feels alive in a way Earth didn't anymore. People moving, talking, living normal lives. Children running through fields that aren't really fields. Skies that aren't really skies. And the cinematography leans into this illusion beautifully. Everything looks real at first glance, but there's always a slight curve, a subtle distortion that reminds you this isn't home. It's a reconstruction, a memory shaped into something functional. And right in the middle of it, Cooper feels like a stranger. Not because people don't recognize him, but because time has placed him outside of everything familiar. The world moved on, evolved, adapted, and has been dropped back into it like a piece from the past that no longer fully fits. There's a moment where he stands in front of the recreated farmhouse again. The same structure, the same layout, every detail preserved with almost obsessive accuracy. And it's easy to assume this is meant to comfort him, to give him something recognizable. But honestly, it does the opposite, because it highlights how much has changed. That house doesn't belong to him anymore. It belongs to history, and that realization quietly pushes him towards something else. Movement. He can't stay here. Not because he's rejected, but because he doesn't belong in this version of the future. His story isn't meant to end in a museum of memories. And the film doesn't spell this out directly. It lets you feel it through his actions. The way he moves, the way he looks at things, the way he doesn't settle. Then comes the reveal. Amelia is still alive. On Edmund's planet. The last confirmed transmission placed her there, continuing the mission, building the foundation of a new colony. And what makes this detail so important isn't just that she survived, it's what it represents. A continuation. A thread of the story that hasn't been closed yet. Because while Cooper's arc with Murph reached its emotional conclusion, his connection to Amelia is still unresolved. And it's different, less defined, less emotional on the surface, but still meaningful. They went through something together that no one else can fully understand. The loss, the time, the decisions, the consequences, all of it created a bond that doesn't need to be explained in words. And now, she's out there. Alone. Or at least, she was. Cooper finds Taz again. And this reunion, while subtle, carries its own kind of weight. Because Taz isn't just a machine in this story. He's been a constant. A balance between logic and loyalty, calculation and trust. And even now, he remains exactly what has always been: reliable, precise, quietly essential. Their interaction feels familiar, almost grounding after everything that's happened. And together, they begin to piece together what comes next. There's a ship, a ranger, not heavily guarded, not impossible to access, just there. And what makes this moment so interesting is how simple it feels compared to everything else. After black holes, time dilation, and impossible dimensions, the next step comes down to something almost ordinary, taking a ship and leaving. But emotionally, it's anything but simple. Because this isn't a mission given to him. It's a decision he's making on his own. And that difference changes everything. As he prepares to leave, there's no dramatic farewell. No one trying to stop him. No large-scale conflict standing in his way. The station continues functioning as if nothing significant is happening, and that quiet indifference reinforces the idea that Cooper's role in this world is already complete. He doesn't need permission. He doesn't need approval. He just goes. The launch sequence mirrors the earlier one, but with a completely different emotional context. Before, it was about leaving something behind. Now, it's about moving towards something unknown. The visuals open up again, the station shrinking behind him, Saturn stretching out in the distance. And for a brief moment, there's a sense of calm. Not certainty, not confidence, but clarity. Because for the first time, Cooper isn't driven by obligation or fear. He's not running out of time, not chasing something he's already losing. He's moving forward because he wants to. And that makes this journey fundamentally different from everything that came before. As the Ranger pushes further into space, the scale returns. The vastness, the silence, the overwhelming sense of distance. But it doesn't feel as isolating now. It feels open, like possibility instead of emptiness. And somewhere out there is Edmund's planet. And Amelia. The film doesn't show her immediately. Instead, it cuts to her perspective slowly, carefully. A new world, different from anything we've seen so far. Solid ground, atmosphere, a sky that doesn't feel artificial. And Amelia, standing alone in it, setting up equipment, building something from nothing, continuing the mission even after everything that happened. And there's a quiet strength in that image. Not dramatic, not overwhelming, just steady. Determined. Because while Cooper's journey has been about finding his way back, Amelia's has been about moving forward no matter what. And now, those two paths are about to intersect again. Not because they have to, but because they choose to. And that choice is what finally brings the story full circle. Amelia's world doesn't announce itself with spectacle, and that's exactly why it feels so real. After everything we've seen, collapsing waves, frozen deception, bending light around a black hole, you'd expect this new planet to arrive with some kind of overwhelming reveal. But it doesn't. It's quiet, grounded, almost humble. And that contrast is intentional, because for the first time in the entire film, we're looking at a place that might actually wake. The sky stretches naturally, not curved like the station, not distorted by gravity. The light feels softer, warmer. There's wind, subtle movement in the atmosphere, details that signal life could exist here without constant resistance. And if you notice carefully, the camera lingers just a bit longer on these elements. Not to impress you, but to let you breathe them in. Because this isn't just another stop on the mission. This is the destination they've been chasing from the beginning. Amelia moves through this environment with a kind of quiet focus. No wasted motion, no hesitation. She's been here long enough to understand the stakes in a completely different way than Cooper ever could. For him, the mission was always tied to something behind him. Earth, his children, everything he left. But for Amelia, this is forward. This is the only direction left. And that changes how she carries herself. She sets up equipment, checks readings, builds the early structure of what could become a colony. And the film doesn't rush through this either. It shows the process, the repetition, the patience required to build something from nothing. Because survival here isn't dramatic, it's methodical. Then we see Edmonds. Or rather, what's left of him. There's no emotional build-up to this reveal, no music guiding you toward how you should feel. Just a quiet confirmation. His body, preserved, still. And in that moment, everything Amelia believed, everything she followed her instincts toward, it comes into focus in a different way. She was right about the planet, but she lost the person. And the film lets that contradiction exist without trying to resolve it. Because sometimes, being right doesn't feel like a victory. Sometimes it just means you're the one who has to carry on alone. Back in space, Cooper is getting closer. The journey isn't shown through constant action or tension. Instead, it's paced in a way that reflects his state of mind. There's focus, but also reflection. And this is where the film quietly circles back to something it introduced earlier: choice. Because everything Cooper is doing now is driven by that one thing. Not necessity, not survival, choice. And that makes his movement through space feel different. Slower, more deliberate. Like every second isn't something he's losing, it's something he's finally experiencing without pressure. He looks out into the distance, toward a destination he hasn't seen, toward a person he hasn't spoken to since everything changed. And there's uncertainty in that. Not fear, but something close to it. Because this isn't a reunion guaranteed by mission parameters or survival needs. It's something more human than that. What if she moved on? What if she doesn't need him? What if it's too late? Again, those questions aren't spoken out loud, but they are there. You can feel them in the silence, in the way the film holds certain shots just a little longer than expected. Because for all the science, all the spectacle, this story keeps returning to something simple. Connection. Back on the planet, Amelia continues her work. There's a moment where she stops, just for a second, looks out across the horizon. And the stillness of that moment says more than any dialogue could. Because this is what the mission actually looks like when everything else falls away. Not glory, not discovery, just persistence. And then, something shifts. A distant sound. Not loud, not dramatic, but different enough to break the rhythm. She looks up. The sky is still the same, the environment unchanged. But there's movement now. Something approaching. The film doesn't rush this reveal. It builds it slowly, letting the recognition form piece by piece. Because Amelia doesn't react immediately. She waits, watches, processes, and then she understands. A ship, coming in, from orbit, and suddenly, everything that felt settled isn't anymore. Back in the Ranger, Cooper sees it too. The planet filling his view, growing larger, more detailed, more real with every passing second. And what makes this moment so powerful isn't just the visual scale, it's what it represents. After everything, after time lost, after impossible odds, after crossing through something no human should survive, his hair, not at the end, but at a beginning. The landing sequence is controlled, precise, almost calm compared to everything that came before. No catastrophic failure, no last-second crisis. Just execution, focus, arrival. And when the ship finally touches down, the film doesn't cut away. It stays. Because this moment matters. The door opens. Light spills in. And for a second, neither of them moves. Not Cooper. Not Amelia. Because what happens next isn't about urgency or survival. It's about recognition. About two people who went through something no one else can fully understand, standing at the edge of something new. And the film doesn't rush them into dialogue. It lets the space between them exist. Because sometimes, after everything that's been said, everything that's been lost and found, words aren't the first thing that comes back. Sometimes, it's just presence. And in that silence, the story doesn't feel like it's ending. It feels like it's finally beginning. There's something almost surreal about the way they finally stand in the same space again. No distortion of time, no barriers of distance, no impossible physics separating, just ground beneath their feet and silence between them. And what makes this moment so powerful isn't what they say, it's what they don't. Because after everything they've experienced, everything they've lost and survived, words feel almost unnecessary at first. Amelia is the first to move. Slow, cautious steps forward, like she's still not fully convinced this is real. And honestly, you can feel that hesitation. Because from her perspective, Cooper was gone, lost to something no one comes back from. She moved forward because she had to, because the mission demanded it, because stopping wasn't an option. And now, he's alive. And that changes everything. Cooper steps out of the Ranger, taking in the environment not as a pilot scanning for danger, but as someone seeing possibility for the first time without fear attached to it. The air, the horizon, the gravity beneath him, it all feels different because this time, he's not passing through. He's arrived. And if you notice carefully, the cinematography shifts again. The camera feels more grounded, more stable. No overwhelming scale, no disorienting move, just presence. As if the film itself is finally letting go of tension and allowing the moment to exist without pressure. When they finally stand face to face, there's recognition, but also distance. Not physical, but emotional. Because they didn't just travel across space. They live completely different journeys to get here. And that creates a gap that can't be closed instantly. Amelia breaks the silence first. Not with something dramatic or overly emotional, but with something simple, grounded, real. And that choice matters. Because it reflects who she's become. Someone shaped by survival, by persistence, by the necessity of moving forward even when everything else falls apart. Cooper responds in the same way. There's no attempt to explain everything, no need to revisit every detail of what happened, because somehow they both understand that the past doesn't need to be retold, it's already part of them. And this is where the film quietly shifts its focus one last time, from survival to rebuilding, because Edmund's planet isn't just a safe place. It's a beginning, a foundation for something entirely new. And what makes this so compelling is how understated it is. There's no grand reveal of a fully built colony, no immediate sense of success. It's just the start. Equipment, structures in early stages, a plan that still needs to be executed. And that's the point. This isn't the reward at the end of a journey. It's the responsibility that comes after it. Amelia shows Cooper what she's built so far. The base, the systems, the early signs that life here is possible. And the way she explains it isn't filled with excitement, it's measured, focused. Because she understands that survival isn't guaranteed just because they made it here. It still has to be earned. And Cooper listens. Not as someone leading the mission, but as someone stepping into it. That shift is subtle, but important. Because for the first time, he isn't carrying the entire weight of the decision alone. He's part of something again. A partnership, not a responsibility. They talk about Edmonds, about what happened. And again, the film doesn't push for heavy emotion. It lets the reality exist without forcing a reaction. Loss is acknowledged, but it isn't the focus anymore. because Amelia has already moved through that. She had to. There was no other option. And now, there's something else. Hope. Not the kind that's loud or overwhelming, but something quieter. Steady. Built from everything they've learned, everything they've endured. And that kind of hope feels more real than anything else the film has shown so far. As they move through the base, there's a growing sense that this is where the story was always heading. Not toward an ending, but toward a continuation. Because saving humanity was never the final goal, it was the first step. What comes after is what truly defines whether it mattered. And this is where Cooper's role fully transforms. He's no longer the man trying to get back. He's the one who chose to come here. And that choice changes how he moves, how he speaks, how he exists in this space. There's no urgency pushing him anymore, just intention. They step outside again as the light begins to shift across the planet's surface. The sky changing colors slightly, the environment settling into a rhythm that feels natural, stable. And for a moment, everything is still. No danger, no countdown, no loss hanging over them, just possibility. And the film lingers there, because this is what everything led to. Not a perfect resolution, not a complete answer, but a place where something new can begin. And honestly, that might be the most important idea the film leaves you with. That even after everything breaks, after time pulls people apart, after impossible choices reshape entire lives, there's still a chance to start again. Not by erasing what happened, but by carrying it forward into something new. And as Cooper and Amelia stand there, looking out over a world that doesn't belong to the past, but doesn't fully belong to the future yet either, there's a quiet understanding between them. This time, they are not chasing something. They are building it, together. What makes the ending of Interstellar linger long after it's over isn't just the scale of what happened, it's how quietly everything settles. No dramatic final statement, no overwhelming conclusion forcing you to feel a certain way. Instead, it leaves you in a space that feels almost unfinished, but intentionally so. And honestly, that's where the film becomes more than just a story about survival or science. It becomes something reflective, something that stays with you because it doesn't close every loop in a traditional way. If you think about it, everything Cooper went through was driven by a need to return. Every decision, every risk, every sacrifice was connected to that one promise he made to Murph. And in the end, he did return, but not in the way he imagined, not in the time he expected, and not into the life he left behind. That's the part that feels quietly devastating if you sit with it long enough. Because achieving the goal didn't restore what was lost. It just gave it meaning. And what makes this even more interesting is how the film reframes that idea through its final moments. Instead of focusing on what Cooper lost, it shifts toward what remains possible. That's a subtle but powerful change. Because it suggests that the purpose of his journey wasn't to reclaim the past. It was to make the future possible, even if he wouldn't fully be part of it. And this is where the film's deeper theme starts to surface more clearly. Time doesn't move for us. It doesn't wait for closure, doesn't pause for emotion, doesn't adjust itself to make outcomes feel fair. It moves forward, constantly, and we're left to navigate that movement as best as we can. Cooper's entire arc is built around that idea. He tries to fight time, to outpace it, to find a way around it. But in the end, he has to accept it. And that acceptance is what changes him. Because by the time he reaches Edmund's planet, he's no longer trying to undo anything. He's not chasing a version of life that no longer exists. He's stepping into something new, something uncertain, but also something real. And that shift from resistance to acceptance is what gives the ending its emotional weight. At the same time, the film doesn't ignore the cost of that journey. Murph lived her entire life without her father. That's not something that gets erased or softened by the ending. It remains part of the story, part of the emotional reality that makes everything feel grounded. And what makes a character so powerful is how she transforms that loss into something meaningful. She doesn't just wait for Cooper to come back. She becomes the reason humanity survives. And that transformation is one of the most important arcs in the entire film. Because while Cooper's journey is about movement through space and time, Murph's is about endurance. Staying, learning, solving, carrying the weight of something she doesn't fully understand until much later. And when the two arcs finally connect, it's not about reunion, it's about completion. The watch, the message, the data. All of it comes together in a way that feels both complex and deeply simple at the same time. Because underneath the science, underneath the theories and equations, there's a very human idea holding it all together. Connection. And not just physical connection, but something that extends beyond distance, beyond time, beyond what can be measured or explained easily. The film suggests that some bonds don't break, they evolve. They find new ways to exist, even when everything else changes. And honestly, that's what makes the ghost reveal so impactful. It's not just a twist. It's a redefinition of everything that came before it. Because what seemed like randomness, what felt like mystery, turns out to be something intentional, something driven by love and persistence rather than coincidence. And that changes how you see the entire story. It turns it from a sequence of events into a loop, a connection that was always there, just waiting to be understood. Even the science, as complex as it is, serves that emotional core rather than overshadowing it. The black hole, the wormhole, the tesseract, all of it functions as a way to explore something that isn't strictly scientific. It's about how humans perceive time, how they respond to loss, how they hold on to meaning in situations that don't make sense. And that balance between realism and emotion is what gives the film its unique tone. It never feels like it's teaching you. It feels like it's showing you and letting you decide what it means. And then there's the direction. Christopher Nolan doesn't rush emotional moments. He lets them breathe, often holding shots longer than expected, allowing silence to carry weight instead of filling every gap with dialogue or music. That restraint is what makes scenes like the message sequence or the reunion with Murph feel so authentic. They aren't heightened artificially, they are grounded in real human reactions. The cinematography follows that same philosophy. Wide shots that emphasize isolation, close-ups that capture subtle emotion, natural lighting that makes even the most impossible scenarios feel believable. And then there's the sound. The score doesn't just support the visuals, it shapes them. The use of organ music, the way it builds and recedes, creates a sense of scale that goes beyond what you see on screen. It adds emotional depth without overwhelming the scene, guiding your response without controlling it completely. All of these elements work together to create something that feels cohesive, not just visually or narratively, but emotionally. And that's why the film resonates the way it does. Because it doesn't just tell a story, it creates an experience. One that asks questions instead of giving easy answers. One that leaves space for interpretation. One that stays with you long after it's over. And maybe that's the most important part. Because in the end, Interstellar isn't trying to explain everything. It's trying to make you feel something, and then trust you to figure out what that feeling means. If you go back to the beginning of Interstellar after seeing how everything unfolds, the entire opening feels different in a way that's hard to ignore. The dust, the silence, the slow fading of Earth, it no longer feels like simple setup. It feels like a quiet warning that was already too late to act on. And what makes this so effective is how subtle it is. There's no dramatic collapse, no single catastrophic event that defines the end of the world. Instead, it's gradual. Crops fail one by one, the air becomes harder to breathe, and society doesn't panic. It adapts, but in the wrong direction. It retreats instead of progressing. And that detail matters more than it seems, because the real problem in the beginning isn't just environmental. It's intellectual. Humanity has stopped believing in forward movement. It has stopped looking up. That shift is what makes Cooper feel so disconnected from the world around him. He isn't just a pilot without a purpose. He's someone who still believes exploration matters in a time when everyone else sees it as wasteful or even dangerous. And you can feel that tension in the smallest moments. The way he reacts during the school meeting, the frustration in his tone when history is rewritten, the way he looks at the sky like it still holds something worth reaching. None of this is exaggerated. It's quiet, controlled, and that's what makes it believable. He doesn't belong in this version of Earth, even before the mission begins. Murph, on the other hand, represents something the world hasn't completely lost yet: curiosity. She doesn't accept things at face value. She questions, observes, and most importantly, she pays attention. And that's why her connection to the so-called ghost becomes so important later on. At first, it feels like a strange, almost out-of-place mystery. Books falling, dust forming patterns, something unseen trying to communicate. But once you understand what's really happening, once you realize it's Cooper reaching back through time, every one of those moments transforms. The bookshelf isn't random. The falling books aren't accidents. The dust patterns aren't coincidence. They are messages. And what makes that so powerful is how simple the method is. There's no advanced technology translating complex data into something understandable. It's physical, basic, almost primitive, because that's all Cooper has access to in that moment. And yet, it works. That idea alone says something important about the way the film approaches intelligence and problem solving. It isn't always about having the most advanced tools. Sometimes it's about understanding how to use what's already there in a way no one else has considered. And this is where the film's relationship with science becomes really interesting. It never presents science as something cold or detached from emotion. Instead, it ties it directly to human need. The equations, the theories, the missions, none of them exist in isolation. They exist because people are trying to survive, trying to protect something, trying to hold on to meaning in a situation that doesn't offer easy answers. Professor Brand represents one side of that idea, the long-term thinker, the one willing to look beyond individual lives and focus on the survival of the species as a whole. But even that perspective becomes complicated when you realize he knew the truth about the equation. He knew it couldn't be solved from Earth. He knew Plan A wasn't going to work the way it was presented. And yet, he continued anyway. That decision introduces one of the most uncomfortable ideas in the entire film. Sometimes hope is constructed, not because it's true, but because people need it in order to keep moving forward. And the film doesn't tell you whether that's right or wrong. It doesn't simplify the morality of it. Instead, it leaves it open, allowing you to sit with the discomfort of that choice. Because on one hand, the lie kept the mission alive. On the other, it meant people were making sacrifices based on something that wasn't entirely real. That same complexity shows up again in Dr. Mann. He's introduced as the best of humanity, the one who was trusted above everyone else. And for a while, that image holds. He seems calm, rational, even hopeful. But when the truth comes out, it doesn't feel like a sudden transformation. It feels like something that's been building quietly under the surface. He didn't fake the data because he wanted to harm anyone. He did it because he was afraid, because isolation changed him, because survival became more important than truth. And that's what makes his character so unsettling. Not that he becomes dangerous, but that his reasoning feels understandable step by step. You can see how he got there. You can follow the logic, even if you don't agree with it. And that's where the film refuses to draw a clean line between right and wrong. Instead, it shows how people make decisions under pressure, how fear can reshape priorities, how even the most trusted individuals can break under the right conditions. And all of this ties back into the film's larger theme. Humanity isn't perfect. It doesn't always act logically, or ethically, or even consistently. But it persists. It keeps going, even when the path forward is unclear, even when the choices are flawed, even when the outcome is uncertain. And that persistence is what ultimately drives the story forward. Not perfection, not certainty, just the refusal to stop. If you look at the structure of the film as a whole, you can see how that idea is reflected in everything. The pacing shifts between stillness and intensity. The narrative moves between grounded realism and abstract concepts. And the characters themselves constantly adapt to situations they never expected to face. It mirrors the journey of humanity itself, starting from something familiar, moving into something unknown, and then returning with a deeper understanding. And that's why Interstellar feels the way it does long after it ends. Not because it answers every question, but because it doesn't try to. It embraces the complexity, the uncertainty, the emotional contradictions that come with a story like this. And in doing that, it creates something that doesn't just explain an idea. It makes you feel it. What makes Interstellar so unique compared to most sci-fi films isn't just the story it tells, it's how it makes you experience time. Not just understand it, but actually feel it slipping, stretching, breaking in ways that are deeply unsettling. And if you notice carefully, the film doesn't rely on heavy explanations to do this. It uses structure, pacing, and emotion to translate something incredibly complex into something human. Take the concept of time dilation, for example. On paper, it's a scientific principle, something you could explain with equations and diagrams. But the film doesn't present it like that. It turns it into something personal. 1 hour on Miller's planet equals 7 years on Earth. And suddenly, time isn't just a measurement anymore. It's loss. It's absence. It's the gap between a father and his children growing wider with every second he spends away. And what makes that so effective is how the film shows the consequence instead of just explaining the rule. Cooper doesn't sit down and calculate what he's losing in a detached way. He feels it later, when it's already gone. Those video messages, the years compressed into minutes, the realization that life moved forward without him, that's where the science becomes emotional. That's where it stops being theoretical and starts being real. And honestly, that's one of the film's greatest strengths. It takes abstract ideas and grounds them in human experience. Even the way the film handles pacing reflects this. Some sequences feel stretched, almost slow to the point of discomfort, while others move quickly, forcing you to keep up. And that variation isn't random. It mirrors the way time feels in different situations. When you're waiting, when you're afraid, when you're losing something, time behaves differently. It's not consistent, and the film leans into that. Then there's the use of silence. This is something that often goes unnoticed on a first watch, but it plays a huge role in how the story is experienced. Space scenes, in particular, avoid the typical loud, explosive sound design you might expect. Instead, there's restraint, sometimes even complete silence. And that choice does something important. It removes the sense of comfort. It reminds you that space isn't designed for human presence. It's indifferent, empty, and that emptiness becomes part of the tension. The docking sequence after Man's betrayal is a perfect example of this. It's intense, visually chaotic, but the sound design keeps pulling you back into that controlled space. You're not overwhelmed by noise. You're focused on precision, on timing, on the fragile balance between success and complete failure. And that makes the moment feel more real, more immediate. The same approach applies to the music. The score doesn't just accompany the scenes, it shapes them. The organ, in particular, adds a sense of scale that goes beyond visuals. It feels vast, almost spiritual, like something larger than the characters themselves is present. But at the same time, it never completely takes over. It supports the emotion without forcing it, allowing moments to breathe instead of overwhelming them. And this balance between sound and silence is what gives the film its rhythm. It knows when to push, when to pull back, when to let a moment exist without interference. And that rhythm becomes even more important when you look at how the film handles its biggest ideas. The Tesseract, for instance, could have easily been presented as something incomprehensible, something purely abstract that exists beyond human understanding. But instead, it's anchored to Murph's room, a familiar space, repeated infinitely. And that choice makes it accessible. It takes something impossible and connects it to something personal. Because at its core, the film isn't trying to explain higher dimensions in a purely scientific way. It's trying to show how humans might experience something like that, through memory, through connection, through repetition. And that approach is consistent throughout the entire story. Every complex idea is filtered through a human lens, making it easier to engage with emotionally even if you don't fully understand the science behind it. And that's where the film separates itself from others in the genre. It doesn't prioritize explanation over experience. It prioritizes feeling. Even the visual effects follow this philosophy. The black hole, Gargantua, isn't just designed to look impressive. It's designed to feel real. The way it bends light, the way it distorts everything around it, the way it holds presence without needing constant attention. It adds to the sense that this is something grounded in reality, even if it's beyond our everyday experience. And that realism is what makes the more emotional moments hit harder. Because when the world feels believable, the stakes feel real. When the environment feels authentic, the consequences feel weighty. And when the science feels grounded, the emotional impact becomes stronger. All of these elements work together to create something that isn't just visually impressive or intellectually engaging, it's immersive. It pulls you into the experience in a way that makes you feel like you're part of it, not just observing it. And maybe that's why the film stays with people the way it does. Not because it gives clear answers. Not because it simplifies complex ideas. but because it lets you experience them in a way that feels human. And once you've felt that, it's hard to see time, space, or even connection in the same way again. One of the most overlooked aspects of Interstellar is how carefully it builds its characters without ever making it feel forced. There's no long backstory dumps, no heavy exposition explaining who these people are. Instead, you learn through behavior, through choices, through the way they react under pressure. And that approach makes every decision they make later feel earned rather than scripted. Take Cooper, for example. At the beginning, he's not introduced as a hero in the traditional sense. He's a farmer, grounded, practical, slightly frustrated with the world around him. But underneath that, there's something unresolved, a need for something more. And the film never directly says it, but you can feel it in the way he looks at the sky, in the way he reacts to limitations. He's someone who was built for exploration but forced into survival, and that internal conflict quietly drives everything he does. Murph's character evolves in a completely different way. As a child, she's curious, emotionally driven, unwilling to accept things she doesn't understand. And that curiosity is what connects her to the ghost, what pushes her to keep questioning even when no one else does. But as she grows older, that same curiosity transforms into something sharper, more focused, almost stubborn. And that shift is important because it shows how time and loss reshape her without completely removing what made her unique in the first place. By the time she's working on the equation, she isn't just trying to solve a problem. She's trying to prove something. To herself, to her father, to the world that dismissed her earlier instincts. And that emotional layer is what makes her success feel meaningful. It's not just intellectual achievement, it's personal resolution. Amelia, on the other hand, represents something the film doesn't explore as openly in its other characters: intuition. Her belief in Edmund's planet isn't based purely on data. There's something else driving it. And when she talks about love as a form of connection that transcends time and space, it initially feels out of place. Almost too abstract compared to the grounded science around it. But the more you think about it, the more it fits. Because the film itself keeps reinforcing that idea in subtle ways. Cooper reaching Murph across time. Murph holding on to the belief that her father will come back. The choices people make that aren't entirely logical, but still lead to something meaningful. It suggests that not everything important can be measured or calculated. Some things exist outside of that framework, and still matter just as much. Even Taz, as a character, adds something unique to the dynamic. On the surface, he's a machine, precise, logical, built for efficiency. But the way he interacts with the crew, the way his humor and honesty settings are adjusted, creates a personality that feels surprisingly grounded. He isn't just there for technical support, he becomes a stabilizing presence, especially in moments where human emotion might cloud judgment. And that balance between logic and emotion shows up repeatedly throughout the film. Characters making decisions based on data. Characters making decisions based on feeling. And sometimes, those two approaches clash. Dr. Mann is the clearest example of what happens when survival overrides everything else. His actions aren't framed as pure villainy. They are framed as desperation. And that distinction matters, because it keeps the story grounded in reality. People don't always act in clear, predictable ways when they are pushed to their limits. And that's what makes the character dynamics in the film feel so authentic. No one is completely right. No one is completely wrong. They are all navigating situations that don't have perfect solutions. And that complexity extends to the relationships as well. Cooper and Murph's bond is the emotional core of the film, but it's not simple. It's filled with tension, misunderstanding, absence. It evolves over time in a way that reflects real relationships, not idealized ones. There's love there, but also frustration, distance, unresolved conflict. And yet, that connection never fully breaks. It stretches, it changes, but it remains. Cooper and Amelia's dynamic is more subtle, but just as important. It's not built on long conversations or clearly defined emotional moments. It's built through shared experience, through trust developed under pressure, through moments where they rely on each other without needing to explain why. And that kind of connection feels different, less obvious, but still meaningful. By the time they reach the end, their relationship isn't something that needs to be defined explicitly. It exists in the space between them, shaped by everything they've gone through together. And that restraint in how relationships are presented is one of the film's strongest choices. It doesn't over-explain. It doesn't force emotional beats. It allows connections to develop naturally, leaving room for interpretation. And that approach makes the entire story feel more human. Because real relationships aren't always clear. They are complicated. They evolve. They carry weight that isn't always visible on the surface. And by reflecting that, Interstellar creates characters that don't just serve the plot. They feel like people. What really elevates Interstellar beyond just a powerful story is how it understands scale, not just visually, but emotionally. Because a lot of films can show you something big. Massive planets, endless space, catastrophic events. But very few can make that scale feel personal at the same time. And that's exactly what this film does, almost effortlessly, by constantly shifting your perspective between the vastness of space and the intimacy of human experience. There are moments where the visuals are overwhelming, gargantua dominating the frame, the endurance looking impossibly small against the curvature of space, entire planets reduced to hostile environments that feel indifferent to human survival. And in those moments, the film reminds you how insignificant humans are in the grand scheme of the universe. It doesn't exaggerate it. It doesn't dramatize it unnecessarily. It just presents it as fact. But then, almost immediately, it pulls you back. A close-up of Cooper's face. A message from Murph. A quiet conversation between characters trying to make sense of something they can't fully control. And suddenly, that massive scale doesn't feel distant anymore. It feels connected to something human. Something fragile. Something that can be lost. That constant shift is what creates the film's emotional rhythm. You're never allowed to get too comfortable in one perspective. If things feel too big, it brings you back to something small. If things feel too contained, it expands outward again. And that balance keeps the experience engaging in a way that feels natural rather than forced. The docking sequence after Dr. Mann's betrayal is a perfect example of this balance. Visually, it's intense. The spinning endurance, the damaged module, the precision required to match rotation and dock successfully, it's all happening on a scale that feels almost impossible to manage. But at the center of that chaos is something very simple. Control, focus, trust. Cooper doesn't panic. He doesn't overcomplicate the situation. He narrows everything down to what matters in that moment. And the way the scene is constructed reflects that mindset. The camera movement becomes more controlled, the pacing tightens, the sound design sharpens. Everything aligns with his perspective, allowing you to experience the moment the way he does. And that's what makes it work. It doesn't just show you the action, it puts you inside it. The same principle applies to the more emotional moments as well. When Cooper watches the video messages after returning from Miller's planet, the scene isn't visually complex. There's no large-scale spectacle, no dramatic setting. It's just him, sitting, watching time unfold in front of him in a way he can't change. And yet, it feels heavier than anything else in the film. Because the scale isn't physical. It's emotional. Years of life compressed into minutes. Moments he'll never get back. A version of his children that exists without him. And that contrast between simplicity and impact is what makes the scene unforgettable. The film understands that scale isn't always about size. Sometimes, it's about weight. About what something means. About what it costs. Even the black hole itself is presented in a way that reflects this idea. It's massive, incomprehensible, something that bends reality in ways that shouldn't be possible. But when Cooper enters it, the focus doesn't stay on the scale of the phenomenon. It shifts to something smaller. Murph's room, a single space, a single connection. And that shift is what makes the moment work emotionally. Because instead of getting lost in the complexity of what's happening, you ground it in something familiar. Something that matters. And that's a pattern the film repeats consistently. Big ideas, anchored to small, human elements. Massive stakes, tied to personal decisions. Unimaginable environments, experienced through relatable emotion. And that approach allows the film to explore concepts that could easily feel distant or abstract without losing engagement. It keeps everything connected. It keeps everything meaningful. Even in the final moments, when Cooper reaches Amelia's planet, the scale shifts again. The vastness of space gives way to something grounded. A horizon, a surface, a place that can be walked on, built on, lived in. And that transition feels important, because it represents a kind of stability the film hasn't offered before. Not certainty, but possibility. And that's the difference. The film never promises a perfect outcome. It never suggests that everything is solved. Instead, it presents a space where something new can begin. And by the time you reach that point, after everything that came before it, that idea feels more meaningful than any definitive ending could. Because it's not about finishing the journey. It's about continuing it. And that's why Interstellar resonates on such a deep level. Not because it shows you something big, but because it makes you feel it in a way that's personal. What's fascinating about Interstellar is how it quietly builds tension without always relying on obvious conflict. There are moments, of course, where the stakes are clear and immediate, life or death, success or failure. But some of the most powerful tension in the film comes from something much subtler. It comes from uncertainty, from the unknown, from the space between decisions where no outcome feels completely safe. And if you notice carefully, the film creates this feeling not by overwhelming you, but by holding back. It doesn't always show you everything. It doesn't explain every detail right away. Instead, it allows gaps to exist, and those gaps are where tension grows. Take the wormhole sequence, for example. On paper, it's a breakthrough moment, a gateway to another galaxy, a solution to a problem that seemed impossible. But the way it's presented doesn't feel purely hopeful. There's hesitation, confusion. The characters don't fully understand what they are entering, and that lack of clarity carries into the audience's experience as well. You're not just watching them go through it, you're feeling the uncertainty with them. And that's what makes the moment effective. It's not just about what's happening, it's about what could happen. The same principle applies to the decisions the characters make throughout the story. Every choice feels like a risk, not because the film tells you it is, but because you understand what's at stake. When they choose which planet to visit, when they decide whether to trust Dr. Mann, when Cooper makes the call to detach from the Endurance, none of these moments feel simple. They feel heavy, because the consequences aren't always immediate. Sometimes, they unfold slowly, and that delayed impact creates a different kind of tension, one that lingers even after the moment has passed. Dr. Mann's storyline is built almost entirely on this idea. At first, everything seems fine. He's cooperative, calm, even optimistic. There's no obvious sign that something is wrong. And that's exactly what makes it unsettling. Because the film doesn't signal danger in a typical way. It lets the discomfort build gradually, almost subconsciously. Small inconsistencies, subtle shifts in behavior, moments that don't quite align. And before anything is revealed, you already feel that something is off. That's restraint. That's control. And it makes the eventual reveal feel earned rather than forced. Even the action sequences follow this pattern. They aren't constant. They don't dominate the narrative. Instead, they appear at specific moments, breaking through the slower pacing in a way that feels impactful rather than overwhelming. And because the film takes its time between these moments, each one carries more weight. The docking scene isn't just intense because of what's happening physically, it's intense because of everything that led up to it. The trust that was broken, the risk that's being taken, the understanding that failure isn't just an option, it's likely. And yet, the film never turns that tension into chaos. It keeps it controlled, focused, almost quiet in its intensity. And that choice makes the experience feel more grounded, more real. The same goes for the emotional tension between characters. It isn't always expressed through arguments or dramatic confrontations. Sometimes, it's in what isn't said. In the distance between Cooper and Murph, in the silence after a difficult decision, in the moments where characters choose not to share everything they are thinking. And that restraint makes those relationships feel more authentic. Because real tension doesn't always come from conflict. Sometimes, it comes from absence, from distance, from things left unresolved. And that's something the film understands deep. Even in the final act, when the stakes shift from survival to understanding, that tension doesn't dissipate. It just changes form. It becomes less about immediate danger and more about whether the connection will be made, whether the message will be understood, whether everything that's happened will actually lead to something meaningful. And that kind of tension is harder to create because it relies on emotional investment rather than physical stakes. But the film manages it, because by that point, you care, not just about what happens, but about what it means. And that's the difference. Because tension isn't just about keeping the audience on edge. It's about giving them a reason to stay there, to stay engaged, to stay connected. And Interstellar does that by trusting its audience, by allowing moments to breathe, by resisting the urge to over-explain, by letting uncertainty exist without immediately resolving it. And in doing that, it creates a kind of tension that doesn't just fade when the scene ends. It stays with you. It follows you through the story. And sometimes, even after it's over. What really makes Interstellar stand out isn't just its story or visuals. It's the questions it leaves you with after everything is over. Not simple questions with clear answers, but the kind that stay in your mind, shifting slightly every time you think about them. And honestly, that might be the most powerful thing the film does. It doesn't just give you an experience. It gives you something to wrestle with. One of the biggest ideas the film keeps returning to is the concept of sacrifice. But it never presents it in a straightforward way. It doesn't frame sacrifice as purely noble or purely tragic. Instead, it shows how complicated it really is. Cooper leaves his children to try and save humanity. On the surface, that feels like a necessary decision, maybe even a heroic one. But when you look closer, it's also deeply personal. It's a father choosing to walk away from his family, not knowing if he'll ever come back. And the film doesn't let you forget that. Every time Cooper makes progress in the mission, there's a quiet reminder of what he's losing in the process. Every hour spent on another planet, every delay, every unexpected event, it all adds up. And by the time he finally understands the full impact of that lost time, it's already irreversible. Murph's perspective adds another layer to this idea. For her, the sacrifice isn't something she chose. It's something that was done to her. She grows up feeling abandoned, trying to make sense of a decision that she wasn't part of. And that difference in perspective is what makes their relationship so emotionally complex. Because from Cooper's point of view, he left to protect her future. From Murph's point of view, he left her behind. And both of those things are true at the same time. That's what makes the film so effective in how it handles emotional conflict. It doesn't force you to pick a side. It allows both perspectives to exist, even when they contradict each other. Another idea the film explores is trust. Not just trust between people, but trust in decisions, in instincts, in things that can't always be proven. Amelia's belief in Edmund's planet is a perfect example of this. She argues for it not just based on data, but on something more intuitive. Something that doesn't fit neatly into the scientific framework the mission is built on. At first, that feels risky, unreliable, but by the end, it turns out she was right. And that raises an interesting question. How much of what we consider rational is actually limited by what we can measure? And how much do we dismiss simply because it doesn't fit into that structure? The film doesn't answer that directly, but it keeps pushing you to think about it. Even the concept of love is treated in a way that feels different from most films. It's not just an emotional connection between characters. It's presented almost like a force. Something that exists beyond time, beyond space. Something that influences decisions in ways that logic alone can't explain. That idea could have easily felt out of place in a story built around science. But it doesn't, because the film supports it through action rather than just dialogue. Cooper reaching Murph through the Tesseract. Murph holding on to the belief that her father is still communicating with her. The choices people make that aren't entirely logical, but still lead to something meaningful. All of it reinforces the idea that not everything important can be reduced to data. And that's a bold choice, because it challenges the expectation that science and emotion have to be separate. Instead, it suggests that they can coexist, that one doesn't diminish the other, that both are necessary in understanding the world and ourselves. And then there's the question of survival. What does it actually mean to survive? Is it enough to simply continue existing? Or does survival require something more, something that gives it meaning? The film leans toward the second idea, because it doesn't just show humanity escaping Earth. It shows them carrying their history, their relationships, their need for connection into whatever comes next. It suggests that survival isn't just about staying alive. It's about preserving what makes life worth living. And that's why the ending feels the way it does. It doesn't present survival as a victory. It presents it as a responsibility, a continuation, something that still requires effort, understanding, and choice. And maybe that's why Interstellar feels so different from other films in the same genre. Because it doesn't simplify its ideas. It doesn't give you clear conclusions. Instead, it opens up space for interpretation, for reflection, for questions that don't have easy answers. And in doing that, it creates something that doesn't just stay on the screen. It stays with you, long after the story ends. What's even more fascinating about Interstellar is how it completely redefines what a resolution feels like. Because if you really think about it, the film doesn't end in a traditional sense. There's no final victory moment where everything is clearly solved, no definitive conclusion that ties every thread neatly together. Instead, it gives you something far more subtle, a sense of continuation. And that choice is what makes the ending feel so real, even after everything extraordinary that came before. Most stories are built around closure. They guide you toward a final answer, a point where all the uncertainty disappears and everything makes sense. But this film does the opposite. It removes the urgency, the immediate stakes, and replaces them with something quieter, something open. And at first, that can feel almost incomplete, like something is missing. But the more you sit with it, the more you realize nothing is missing. It's just not being forced. Cooper's journey is the clearest example of this. For most of the film, his goal is simple, even if the path to it isn't. He wants to return, to get back to his children, to fulfill the promise he made. And in a way, he does. But not in the form you expect. Not in a way that restores what was lost. And that's what makes it feel honest. Because real life doesn't always give you the version of closure you're hoping. Murph grows up. She builds a life. She becomes something greater than the child he left behind. And when they finally reunite, it isn't about starting over. It's about acknowledging everything that already happened. There's no attempt to recreate the past, no illusion that things can go back to how they were. Instead, there's acceptance. And that acceptance is what allows the story to move forward. Because holding on to the past too tightly would stop everything else from happening. And the film understands that. It doesn't punish Cooper for leaving. It doesn't reward him with a perfect reunion. It places him in a position where he has to let go even after everything he did to come back. And that's where the emotional weight really lands. Because letting go isn't presented as failure. It's presented as growth. Murph's final decision reflects this perfectly. She doesn't ask him to stay. She doesn't try to hold on to him, even though she spent her entire life waiting for him to return in some way. Instead, she recognizes that their story has already reached its natural conclusion. And that moment feels incredibly mature. Not dramatic, not overwhelming, just true. And once that connection is resolved, the film shifts again. Not toward an ending, but toward a beginning. Amelia's planet represents something entirely new. A space untouched by everything that came before, a place where humanity can start again without the weight of a dying world holding it back. But even here, the film avoids presenting it as a perfect solution. It's not finished. It's not guaranteed. It's just possible. And that distinction matters. Because it reinforces the idea that survival isn't the end goal. It's the starting point for something else. Something that still needs to be built, still needs to be understood, still needs to be sustained. And that brings the entire story full circle. From a world that was slowly fading to a space where something new can grow. From a mission driven by necessity to a choice driven by intention. From a story about leaving to one about arriving. And what makes this transition so effective is how understated it is. There's no grand speech explaining what comes next, no detailed vision of the future being laid out. Instead, the film leaves it open, allowing you to imagine what happens beyond the final frame. Will the colony succeed? Will humanity learn from its past? Will the same mistakes repeat themselves in a new environment? Those questions aren't answered. And that's the point, because the film isn't trying to predict the future. It's trying to create space for it. And in doing that, it invites you to think beyond the story itself, to consider what these ideas mean outside of the film, to reflect on how progress, survival, and connection shape the world we live in. And maybe that's why Interstellar feels so impactful even after multiple viewings. Not because it changes, but because your perspective does. Each time you watch it, different moments stand out, different ideas resonate, different questions come into focus. And that evolving experience is what gives the film its lasting power. Because it doesn't just exist as a fixed story. It grows with you. And that's something very few films manage to achieve. At its core, Interstellar isn't really about space travel, black holes, or even survival. It's about perspective. And more specifically, how perspective changes depending on where you stand in time, in space, and in emotion. Because what feels like the right decision in one moment can look completely different when viewed from another. And the film keeps returning to this idea again and again, not by explaining it directly, but by showing you how each character experiences the same reality in completely different ways. Cooper sees the mission as a necessity, a chance to give his children a future, even if it means leaving them behind in the present. From where he stands, the decision makes sense. It's painful, but it's justified. But Murph doesn't see it that way. From her perspective, it's abandonment. It's a promise broken before it even had a chance to be kept. And the film never tries to prove one of them right and the other wrong. Instead, it allows both perspectives to exist at the same time, creating a kind of emotional tension that doesn't need resolution to feel real. That same idea extends to almost every major decision in the story. When the crew chooses which planet to visit, they aren't just making a scientific calculation. They are making a choice shaped by limited information, by pressure, by personal belief. And once that choice is made, there's no way to fully predict how it will unfold. Miller's planet looks promising from a distance, but once they arrive, it becomes clear how misleading perspective can be. What appears calm and manageable from orbit turns into something dangerous and unpredictable on the surface. And that shift happens again with Dr. Mann. From afar, he represents hope, the best of humanity, a scientist who stayed committed to the mission longer than anyone else. But up close, that image breaks apart. His reality is completely different from the one the crew imagined. Isolation, fear, and the need to survive reshape his perspective until his actions start to feel justified to him, even if they seem wrong from the outside. And that's what makes his character so important. He isn't just a plot twist. He's a reflection of how easily perspective can change under pressure, how quickly certainty can turn into doubt, how even the strongest ideals can shift when survival is at stake. The film reinforces this idea visually as well. The way planets are shown from space compared to how they feel on the ground. The way time behaves differently depending on where you are. The way environments that seem distant and abstract suddenly become immediate and overwhelming once you're inside them. Even the Tesseract follows this pattern. From a conceptual standpoint, it's something beyond human understanding. A higher dimensional space that shouldn't be accessible or visible in any meaningful way. But once Cooper enters it, it's presented through something familiar. Murph's room. And that transformation makes it understandable, not because the concept itself becomes simpler, but because the perspective changes. It's no longer something distant and theoretical. It becomes something personal, something he can interact with, something that connects directly to his experience. And that's what allows the story to resolve in the way it does. Because the answer isn't found by stepping further away from human understanding, it's found by bringing the problem closer to it, by grounding it in something real, something emotional, something meaningful. And that idea carries through to the ending as well. From a large-scale perspective, humanity survives. The mission succeeds. A new future becomes possible. But on a personal level, the story is much more complicated. Relationships have changed. Time has passed. The version of life that once existed is gone. And both of those realities exist at the same time. Success and loss. Progress and distance. Hope and absence. The film doesn't try to separate them. It lets them coexist. And that coexistence is what makes the story feel grounded, even when the events themselves are extraordinary. Because real life doesn't offer clean outcomes. It offers laid ones. Situations where something can be gained and lost at the same time. Where moving forward means leaving something behind. Where perspective determines how you interpret what happened. And maybe that's why Interstellar resonates so deeply. Because it doesn't tell you how to feel about its ending. It gives you the space to decide. to look at it from different angles, to shift your perspective over time. And in doing that, it mirrors the very thing it's exploring. Because just like the characters, your understanding of the story changes depending on where you stand. And when you step back and look at everything Interstellar has taken you through, it's hard to see it as just a film anymore. It feels more like a journey you experienced rather than a story you watched. Because by the time you reach this point, something shifts inside you, not dramatically, not all at once, but quietly. The way you think about time, about connection, about what really matters, it doesn't stay exactly the same. And maybe that's the real impact of the film. Not the spectacle, not the science, but the way it changes how you feel about things you thought you already understood. Time, for example, stops being just numbers on a clock. It becomes something more fragile, something you can lose without realizing it. Every moment Cooper spent away, every decision that cost him years he could never get back, it forces you to think about your own time differently. How easily it passes, how impossible it is to reclaim once it's gone. And then there's connection, not just between characters, but the idea that some bonds don't fade, even when everything else does. Cooper and Murph's relationship isn't perfect. It's strained, broken at times, shaped by distance and misunderstanding. And yet, it never disappears. It finds a way to exist across time, across space, across everything that should have separated them completely. And that idea stays with you, because it suggests that connection isn't always about proximity. It's about meaning. It's about what you choose to hold on to, even when it's difficult, even when it hurts. And that ties directly into the film's final message, even if it's never stated outright. Moving forward doesn't mean forgetting. It means carrying everything with you and still choosing to continue. Cooper doesn't return to reclaim his old life. He moves forward into something new. Murph doesn't wait for the past to come back. She builds something that allows the future to exist. Amelia doesn't stop when she's left alone. She keeps going, even when there's no guarantee of success. And all of those choices reflect the same idea, that progress isn't about perfect outcomes. It's about persistence, about continuing even when the path isn't clear, even when the result isn't certain. And that's what gives the ending its quiet strength. It doesn't overwhelm you with emotion. It doesn't force a conclusion. It simply presents a moment and lets you feel it. Cooper and Amelia standing on a new world, not as heroes, not as saviors, but as people who made it through something impossible and now have to decide what comes next. And that what comes next is never answered, because it doesn't need to be. The story isn't about what they will build. It's about the fact that they can. That after everything, after loss, after distance, after time itself became an obstacle, they still reached a place where something new is possible. And that possibility is enough. That open ending, that refusal to define every detail, is what makes the film linger. Because it doesn't close the experience for you. It leaves space for your own interpretation, your own reflection, your own questions. And those questions don't fade easily. What would you have done in Cooper's place? Would you have made the same choices? Would you have left? Would you have come back? Would you have kept going? The film never answers these directly, but it leaves them with you. And maybe that's why people keep returning to Interstellar again and again. Not just to watch it, but to understand it a little differently each time. Because every viewing adds something new. A detail you didn't notice. An emotion you didn't feel the same way before. A perspective that shifts just enough to make the story feel fresh again. And in that sense, the film never really ends. It just continues, in your mind, in your interpretation, in the way it quietly reshapes how you see things. And honestly, that might be the most powerful kind of storytelling there is. Not something that tells you everything, but something that stays with you, asking you to keep thinking long after it's over. And just like that, the journey doesn't stop here. It simply moves forward, just like everything else.